Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the Quebec shooting. 6 killed, 5 injured late Sunday. A 27-year-old University of Laval student is listed as the main suspect, with another man who is being held as a witness with us to talk about it. He was a director of communications for the Speaker of Parliament in the days of Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin. Nicholas Ruskowski, managing director at Publicis Consultants. Welcome back as well to Quebec-born security and counter-terror consultant Yann Saint-Pierre, who joins us from Berlin, and in the Canadian capital, Ottawa, journalist and columnist Brian Lilly. We were talking just before the break. Nicholas Ruskowski, just your reaction to what we heard from Yann Saint-Pierre, that it was perhaps a bit quick off the gun to call it terrorism. That's one aspect of which both the Quebec and the Canadian Prime Minister could have been a little more cautious.
I think that there's two things that strike me in that stream of commentary. The first is the need to reconcile the rather ironic proposition that, on the one hand, police and the authorities need to go faster, and on the other hand, that it's not appropriate to have gone forward with what they said. I'm not an expert on terrorism and its legal definitions. I do know that the impact for certain on the community that lived through that particular ordeal yesterday evening was one that equates to a feeling of terror, a feeling of complete fear, a feeling of loss of control. And in that way, it's not dissimilar to previous acts of domestic terrorism that we've seen in the United States, in Canada, and other parts of the world. That being said, I do think that if we're going to preach patience on naming these things, it's equally responsible not to try and substitute our judgment to those of the authorities that are working to figure this out.
Yann Saint-Pierre, you mentioned just before the break the Nice attack, but if we're talking about somebody who is a radical far right, if that is what they're motivating him, there are precedents like Dylan Roof attacking that church in Charleston, South Carolina, like Andre Breivik in Norway. How common are these attacks, if it is indeed that?
Well, they're more and more common. That's one of the biggest problems over the last couple of years, and this comes back, to the rhetoric that's being used for political campaigns, for politics in general, is that they're creating a situation, an environment where people like this feel that their actions can be justified. If you look at what happened in Great Britain last year with the murder of MP Joe Cox, that was also far-right activist. The stabbing of a current Cologne mayor, Henriette Recker, just before her stance on refugees, that was also a far-right extremist. The number of attacks linked to that, linked to these types of extremists, have skyrocketed in the last couple of years, exactly because a lot of people are trying to do a lot of political capital on this. And so, yeah, the need for caution is there because people feel more and more empowered to do something, and this is why we're seeing more and more of these attacks anywhere in the world.
Brian Lilly, you agree?
No, not at all. Look, the politics of Quebec does not lend itself to far-right extremism. It's almost non-existent in the province of Quebec today. While I think that police should be willing to jump forward, and I have no problem with the Prime Minister or Premier Couillard calling it terrorism, jumping straight ahead and saying this is far-right extremism, one of the people who is held as a witness, we believe, but he could be the suspect, Mohammed Kadir, is this, one of the most common forms of Muslim terrorism that we've seen, which is Muslim on Muslim? Was there an internal beef? That's just as valid right now as saying there's some kind of right-wing extremism taking over Quebec. I don't see that happening.
I just have to jump in there.
I disagree fully.
That comment belies a misunderstanding of the Quebec scene. I don't know what Brian would like to call it, but if he were prepared to deny that there's a strong stream of ethnic nationalism that runs through Quebec historically in its politics, I think that would be an extraordinary mistake in terms of his understanding. I think if I can just finish my one comment.
I've been there and I've covered that. And it's quite often from far left parties, not far right. We can get into whether it's an ethnic nationalism thing, but far right politics is not part of the Quebec firmament, hasn't been for a long time.
I know. One of the biggest problems was the precedent party to the CAQ, to the CAQ, the ADQ, actually had to focus its platform in the mid-90s around a rhetoric of exclusion, solely focusing more on the nationalist trend. And this is really one of the things that doesn't have to be in the political party, it doesn't have to be in a movement, but the general mood in Quebec, and you might go back to the famous Bouchard-Taylor Commission that had spawned this entire debate of accommodement raisonnable, of understanding, of being accommodating. All these issues have brought a lot of things up in the Quebec society that's a lot more divided than people want to make it to be, but it's there. There's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of division, and this is exactly where things like this come out. And yes, far right hasn't been labeled that way so far, and I agree with some Muslim violence, but it hasn't been that targeted so far, especially not in North America. And as such, I think we're really seeing a symptom of what's been going on in Quebec over the last 20 years.
How do you explain it?
But,
why Quebec?
See, this is why I think that...
Yann Saint-Pierre,
why Quebec? Yes, well, Quebec has going back to its nationalist movement, there's been, on the one hand, it's very welcoming, it's very people are very, very open. On the other hand, people close down, everything's divided. I always joke that, you go to eastern part of Montreal, it's in French. You go to western part of Montreal, it's in English. Down the middle, it's every language of the world. But it's a very divided community. It's very isolated in many ways. It's one thing to have the image of multicultural. It's another to actually be there and see how it doesn't really work. And this is something that's developed a lot over the last few decades. And it has many reasons, obviously. But the fact that people have become, are very focused on, even the term pure laine, pure wool, is no longer appropriate, but it was used for decades to identify ethnic Quebecois people, and I know it's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, the last couple of years with multicultural, and there's been some support for, what's absurd, but Pegida Quebec, the right-wing, the far-right movement in Europe, in Quebec. So there's a lot of stuff that used to be latent, but now it's coming out, and we're seeing some of the consequences.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24debate. One, the attack at the Mosque Sainte-Foy does not surprise me, considering how the government of Quebec legislated so many targeted laws at the Muslim community. Is that true, Nicholas Ruskowski?
Well, let's just take a step back. I think there are a few comments that bear mentioning in the context of first what Brian Lilly was saying. I think Brian does make an interesting point in arguing that political labels may not suffice anymore. And so I'm not sure that it's constructive to talk about whether it's the far right, the far left. The truth is, it's much more instructive to look at not only the history of Quebec, but the history of Canada. And if I'm completely honest, notwithstanding my patriotic instincts, the history of Canada is one that's very complex in terms of the ways that it treats its minorities, and that's not always been honorable. We can think back to World War II and the St. Louis being turned back in Halifax, hundreds, literally almost 1,000 Jewish refugees being turned back, a shameful history that we share with the United States. And so this is part of the Canadian story. It's also part of the Quebec story that we have shades of the kind of ethnic nationalism that we're talking about. As for recent debate in Quebec and again in Canada, it is true that I feel, personally, over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been an inordinate amount of attention on trying to manage legislation, policy, treatment of, for example, Muslim women who choose to wear the veil. A story and an approach that was actually brought into the Canadian firmament by the Conservative Party during the last federal election as well, as trying to bring in a question on the ban of the burqa and other forms of religious covering in the Canadian context. So this has not happened in isolation. You can't even look at it in isolation from what's happening in the United States, but I think it would be unfair to pin it simply on an issue of Quebec. This is a stream of extreme sentiment that unfortunately runs through the history of North American politics and social history.
Brian Lilly, you agree?
This is why I think that we have to have police come forward and be more open with what they know and what the suspects' supposed motivation may have been. I mean, we're sitting here speculating, and we could all be completely wrong. I could be wrong, Yann could be wrong, Nicholas could be wrong. We could all have egg on our face an hour from now whenever they do update us. It's bizarre to watch them sit there this morning all four police forces holding a news conference. They know very much at this point. They know very much what happened, and they refused every entreaty in English and French to try and get some details on this. And now they're worried about how people are talking about it online. We do live in an on-demand news world right now, and police can't just sit back and hold on to this and then get worried when someone gives out the wrong information. Well, if you're worried about the wrong information getting out there, put the right information out there. As far as the treatment of minorities, absolutely right. There's been problems going back for years. There was the big reasonable accommodation debate. Both the PQ, the Parti Québécois in Quebec City, and the Liberals have pushed this idea that there need to be some kind of legislation around face coverings in public service in Quebec. It's been a much more robust debate, a much more agitated debate in Quebec than in the rest of the country, where it was mainly tamped down on by media, but not so in Quebec.
All right, we were talking about how this goes back a long way. Nicholas Ruskowski just telling us how this is deep-rooted. However, the perception is, of course, that Canada has a much more open policy when it comes to refugees. We saw last year those images of the current Prime Minister welcoming Syrian refugees at the airport. And this weekend, after that blanket ban that was suddenly announced by the new U.S. president on citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries, well, the Canadian government stepping in and announcing it's offering temporary residence to any traveler who is stranded as a result of Donald Trump's decision.
We'll continue to ensure that our immigration system is about compassion, efficiency, and economic opportunity, and the protection of the health, safety, and security of Canadians. We welcome those fleeing persecution, terror, and war.
Brian Lilly, you agree with that?
Look, I've been calling for the Liberal government here in Ottawa to welcome more refugees from Syria and Iraq, the ISIS-controlled areas, for some time, particularly Yazidis and Christians. They haven't been willing to do that. Everyone's freaking out about Trump's executive order, calling it a Muslim ban. It's about 12% of the world's Muslim population, but it also affects the Christians, the Yazidis, other ethnic minorities that are trying to flee real violence in the world. But jumping up and down and saying he's banning all Muslims is craziness. You know, I looked at the entry and exit requirements for me to go visit some of these countries, and if I had visited either Israel or certain ports of entry in Jordan or Egypt, I would not be allowed in most of those countries. So there's problematic issues from those countries as well, and there's a reason that he's probably turned around and banned them. If it becomes a permanent ban, it's a real issue, but I'm not crying for Iran anytime soon.
Nicholas Ruskowski?
What I find regrettable in what I've just heard Brian say is equating the government of Iran's policy towards foreigners, which, yes, is inadequate and inappropriate, to the strife of refugees who are actually trying to escape those very governments, and that we would deprive them of the chance to do so. I don't know how he squares that particular circle, regardless of what the protests are. To me, it's a very odd circle to have to square.
Where are the protests on the 16 countries that block Israel?
I don't disagree with you, Brian.
16 countries block Israel. Where are the protests on that?
I don't disagree with you on the fact that it's inappropriate to block travel to Israel. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that I don't know how you square the circle of at once condemning the government of Iran's ridiculous policy and then preventing people that have a legitimate reason to want to escape Iran from doing so, largely on the basis, well, although it may be inconvenient for your argument, Brian, on the basis of their religion. Because when they are Christian, they can leave, which again, I'm all in favor of helping persecuted minorities leave. But some of the Muslims that are trying to leave this country are no less persecuted, and certainly that's the case in places like Syria and Aleppo. That's certainly the case.
This executive order applies to everyone from those countries. So it doesn't say if you're Christian you can come to the United States, but if you're Muslim you can't. It's a blanket ban, and I think there's an awful lot of hypocrisy in those.
Donald Trump took time in his press conference yesterday to specify that he was seeking for remedies for Christian minorities in particular.
Let me bring in Yann Saint-Pierre on this, because you're in Berlin, where there's been a lot of reactions as well. As somebody who studies counterterror, what's the impact of this ban?
Well, I think the first real impact is everybody's capitalizing politically on Trump's back for this. Justin Trudeau did that a couple of days ago. Angela Merkel is positioning herself quite well on this. Boris Johnson maneuvered navigated the waters around it, found a way. So everybody has a boogeyman right now to be able to capitalize on this. And obviously, in terms of counterterrorism for Germany, for them it shows, well, we're not going to have such harsh measures. We have a different way. And for them, it fits quite well, actually, within Angela Merkel's policy of openness and the issue of refugees. So it's more of a boon than a bane for most countries.
Boon than a bane, but let me ask you, Yann, this notion of a clash of civilizations that's touted by ISIS and seems to be touted by some within the far right, certainly some in the alt-right movement. Is this playing into that hand? And irrespective of what Angela Merkel or Justin Trudeau do, this is the way the world is going?
Well, the mentality of us versus them, and whether it's religious, political, it's an identity factor. It allows people to strengthen that identity to say, no, we're different, we're better compared to them. It plays well into the hands of people who want to, of ISIS, as you mentioned. Of people of the alt-right or Marine Le Pen in France. On the other hand, that's exactly why it's so interesting to see people like Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau have a different take on this, because it's probably the best example, the best counter-narrative to such statements, because they actually apply it. And, it's always something, that's annoying, and which is also a reason why these countries also become the target of terrorists, because they want to provoke them into joining a war, into joining a conflict, and leave their ways and their strategies that work for them. So, again, it plays into the hands of Germany and Canada at this point in time.
Brian Lilly?
If Jan was saying that this will provoke people to join ISIS and attack the United States, but not Canada or Germany, I'd love to see any proof of that, because that's put out all the time.
No, quite the contrary.
The fact
what
is,
I mean,
we keep being attacked. Okay.
Yeah, what I meant by
please.
that is it's an incentive to try to diminish the good image. One of the things is, if you go to the Middle East, Canada and Germany have a fantastic image. People like it. And if you find a way to bring them on the same level as the others, people or countries that already have a bad reputation, like the States, like the UK, like France, then you take away some of that aura. You find a way to reinforce your rhetoric. You gave it a certain form of legitimacy and backing. But when countries stand their ground and say, we're actually open, we're going to take in the Muslims, we're going to manage this in a way, that's actually we're not going to put aside our values for this just for the sake of security, then it becomes a counter narrative that's an incitement to increased attacks on Germany and Canada, because the idea is we're going to bring them down to that level. And that's been seen over the last couple of years with ISIS. Yep.
I don't think that most people living in the countries that are part of this ban, if Canada has a good reputation that with the people, I don't see it changing, or maybe it'll improve a little bit. But for those that are already part of this ISIS death cult, and that's what it is, this is not going to change their view of Canada. We are the Crusaders, and they want to kill us, whether Justin Trudeau is welcoming or not. That won't change that.
Actually,
Will it help
not,
on
no.
the main street? Perhaps.
But it doesn't put us in the same light, which is quite there. It doesn't, people focus on Great Britain because they were in Iraq. The U.S. obviously, France because they're striking back. They're really involved in the coalition. Canada and Germany are more low-key. Germany is a bit more prominent because it is Europe's main power right now. But it's not strategically seen as a main military target because they're not as involved. And so the fact that they're flying under the radar and presenting themselves as being much more welcoming and nice is annoying to them, especially in the case of Germany. So in that sense, you know, it is more inciting. I thought it's simply for a strategic purpose of propaganda.
Germany welcomed a million people and still had the Berlin attack. Changing the policy one way or the other, I don't think will stop the terrorists. Will it help real people that are fleeing violence? Sure. Will it stop people that have this ideology ingrained and embedded in their minds? No.
All right, just one final point because we're almost out of time. We're almost out of time. Nicholas Ruskowski.
Just, I find it befuddling and frankly baffling that this debate in a very circular way has brought us to the heart of the problem, which is we're debating whether or not certain countries and politicians are using this to the appropriate political advantage, and lost in that entire debate is what the impact of these actions are on the refugees who are seeking to escape the countries where they're being oppressed on the one hand, or on the victims of these acts of terror and these acts of hate on the other. And I think that where Justin Trudeau's response today was very appropriate is that it put those victims both in Quebec City but also the refugees right back at the center of the story.
Nicholas Ruskowski, I want to thank you. I want to thank Brian Lilly for being with us from the Canadian capital, Ottawa. Yann Saint-Pierre in Berlin. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next.